excited about this. Well, we have a revival of Christian studies, and I'm going to talk again briefly about that. Some of the readings will cover this. First, briefly, I want to talk about my own interests. This is not, I will confess, and confession is part of Celtic theology, good confession, having a soul brothers or soul friend, and you are my soul friends during this season together. I will confess that this is actually not an area of research expertise for me. This is not an area in which I've published on. When I go back and look through my CV, this is not an area in which he is a world expert in that, so that's a confession. So if you want to drop out of this class, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But what I can say is this is actually something that has been journeying alongside of me since my college days. In my junior year of college, I had a church history class with Dr. Mark Knoll, a famous church historian, and I wrote a paper on Patrick of Ireland, my first journey into studying him and reading his writings, the writings you're going to read in this class. And I wrote a paper on that, and that started a process. And ever since then, I wrote another paper on Patrick of Ireland in seminary, a major research paper. I've connected Celtic themes and theologies and studied the spirituality, but more than study in an academic sense, this has been part of my own transformative journey into trying to wrestle with why I felt disconnected, why I felt so lost or so much like an outsider to so much church and academic discussions. And I was drawn to a discussion of nature. I was drawn towards an integrative approach. And Celtic theology for me became tools and partners to say, this is an actual move of the Holy Spirit. I'm not distancing myself from Christianity. I'm distancing myself from a kind of distorted version of Christianity, which is narrow and which has been divisive or divided into different categories, try to divide ourselves into intellect and emotions. And it was like, I needed for my own faith, I struggled with deep clinical depression. I needed to find this integrative path again to give me a hope and way forward. And all throughout Celtic theology, including some of the books I required for this class, were the very books that I first studied as a way of saying, how do I bring this together? How can I be a Christian in a way that is actually bringing fullness? So this class reflects almost 30-year journey for me of sitting with this material as part of my own personal journey, and shaped by study, but also shaped by living in the mountains and wrestling with the realities. And so that's probably why I approach this class differently. I'm not wanting to then impose an outside perspective. I'm actually wanting to share with you all this very pattern, and as much as I can in the context of this structure of a class, invite you into a similar kind of journey. So this is personal. And I think that also models a lot of how Celtic Christianity came together. It wasn't a hierarchy necessarily. They did have hierarchy of ecclesial structure. We had bishops and you had priests and all the rest. But the actual structure of so much of the formation came in these monastic communities where the abbot, the head of this community, was more the leader and guide, and he wasn't above in a hierarchy. He was first among. He was also doing all the things with them. He had experience. He was bringing reflections, but he was also journeying alongside, and that's how I see this version. I'm continuing my journey alongside and now inviting you in, so thank you for joining me. There's also a revival of Christian studies, I think, that's happening a lot because of such a decline of religion and spirituality. The modern era gave us a form, and so many people are still drawn to Jesus. They're still drawn to spirituality, but these forms and models no longer resonate, and they feel like, do I have to give up Christianity? Is this a rejection? And so there are people, myself and so many others, who are saying, well, maybe let's explore what it means to be fully Christian in a new way, as a way of responding to the decline. We don't need to get angry. We don't need to get into culture wars. We don't need to just go more all in on the things that are just historic relics from different cultures or contexts or voices. We don't need to be 16th century Germans in order to find a love for the church. What does it mean to find and respond then to decline of religion and spirituality in a hope-filled, progressing, not progressive, that's a totally different topic, progressing, imaginative way? Is there a way of hope for us? And this is a way of hope for me. I have a lot of struggles and critiques about the church, but this is a way of saying there's actually maybe something here that can actually give us new life. A move towards the mystical in our era. The modern era was science, intellect, holding on to these categories in which you threw out the supernatural, and more, partly because of seeing how limited that is in actually bringing solutions, and how narrow that is in actually addressing the human condition, but also in our wider global discussions of realizing there are cultures and peoples outside of Enlightenment Europe influence that never lost this, that this is an integrated expression of spirituality and life, where there's a move toward the mystical, not anti-intellectual, but just seeing the intellectual is only part of who we are. There's a bigger reality. There's more truth than we can comprehend in our understanding of the world that we have. The modern era really had this physical and experiential side versus the intellectual and cerebral. So they divided these, and you can see this so often in a lot of our denominations. The Pentecostals are physical and experiential. The Presbyterians are intellectual and cerebral, and they don't really understand what each other are doing. And it's easy to say, well, those people, this group isn't, and this group is Christian. But rather than seeing that, just see how our denominations, even our very ecclesial priorities, have isolated us into groups of people who think in divided ways, and we align ourselves with the people who share that particular value, and we align ourselves in different parts of our life. We have our physical and experiential side of life, and we have our intellectual and cerebral. This is why the church and the academy hardly have any interactions anymore and aren't informing each other. But really, the postmodern and leading towards the future is finding this integrative approach where the physical and experiential and intellectual and cerebral are informed together. Now, why is this? Partly because of, as I said, an exhaustion with how the divided models don't actually bring us somewhere. Part of it is actually the very drive that the modern era gave us into better understanding what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to understand reality in a scientific sense and all around us? Well, we realize that our intellect, our mind, our thinking is never separated. We are not minds with a physical form. All of us think in light of our emotions and our physical self. That's why psychology is much more attentive to our neurochemistry and so many others. Our brain creates models of the world that help us navigate it, but may not actually be accurate portrayals of what we're dealing with. Our brain and our intellect are not actually capturing the world as it is. It's capturing the world as it thinks we need it to be. If you've ever seen the show Brain Games, it's a great example of these. But that's also through story. If you look at storytelling, that often a character, you actually are drawn into their story of how they're misinterpreting the world around them, and other people come around. Well, we do that. That's part of the narrative of life, is an interpretation, but also a constant misinterpretation. And if you are not understanding of how we are whole selves, physical, experiential, intellectual, cerebral, all working as a unified expression in both a local community, but also in a mass kind of community where we take on both dysfunctions and kind of cultural expressions. If you don't understand that, you don't know how to navigate how these stories we're telling ourselves are being told to us are intersecting or going against the narrative that Jesus is telling us. Finding a holistic, integrative sense and model is a way of truly understanding who we are, where we are, in light of the bigger vision of God as creator and empowerer and redemptive presence and hope giver for us. So this leads into an integrative interest beyond just our own physical selves. It's also like, I can't just talk about theology if I'm going to be fully Christian, because God isn't just the God of Christianity. God is the Lord of all things. So if God is the Lord of all things, and an understanding of God takes shape in all the different forms of reality and human experience. So I want to be interested in psychology. I want to be interested in science. I want to be interested in geology. I want to be interested in history. I want to be interested in music and culture and movies and all the rest. All these things feed into this integrative interest. And I will admit, I will confess that again and again throughout my life, life, it has been less theology reading that has inspired me into a deeper journey with Christ, and much more theology and scripture in conversation with or being informed by other topics. One of the most profound moments in my college understanding of theology didn't happen in my historical theology class. It happened in my meteorology class, of all things, where I was exposed to chaos theory and began to then think of complexity and integration and influence and sensitivity upon initial conditions that evoked a brand new thinking of how the Holy Spirit worked in my life and all the interconnectedness in the church and all the rest. So that's one of the goals of Celtic studies, is to see how they modeled an integrative interest as part and parcel of their study. So Celtic theology may be ancient in some ways, but it's also very contemporary as we've gone through the modern era and now are coming back around to the kind of wisdom and tendencies that happened then and are still happening in many parts of the world. So global reflections are leading us back to earlier sources, engaging what an African mindset, and Africa is such a big term, you don't want to narrow it, but or an Asian or East Asian or South America, we're actually being confronted with new kinds of questions and theories in which they didn't have this Enlightenment separation, and there was an enforced colonizing kind of Christianity. But now, as they're taking up their voices, we are called to reflect. Is this different than the Christianity we are trying to live out, or is it reminding us? Global reflections lead us back to earlier sources so that we have a better capacity to understand ourselves, our own journey, our missteps, our contributions, and enter into a more fruitful dialogue together. Empowering the local theologies, not competing against them. So what is Celtic Christianity? Coming back around to this. It's expressive of a Christian faith defined geographically, linguistically, temporally, British Isles for the most part, Celtic family of languages, early Middle Ages, around 400 onwards to late Middle Ages, 1200, 1300, 1400 primarily. Not because this is the limitation of Celtic lands, but because this is where Celtic theology and Christianity began to thrive in contexts that were not limited to the kind of continental Europe influences. And so they were able to develop and then even thrive for a relatively limited time until those lands were likewise invaded by later on the English and other groups. But it was a kind of Christianity that existed and throve and left us a massive body of writing. They were, even before they were conquered, they were being informed by and influenced by the Latin-speaking resources of Europe and through trade and all the rest. And they wrote then their thoughts. So many of the broader cultures prior to them, and so many cultures had an engagement with theology or an engagement with culture, but they didn't write it down, which writing doesn't make someone better. It just helps us to learn about it when we're not there anymore. Culture can resonate across various changes in government and rule and tends to persist from below. The people of a group tend to exist within their forms and policies, while the leadership or their patterns or even languages can change. And this happens all over the world. For instance, South America is a great expression of a Spanish language and culture, but there's still much indigenous expressiveness that shapes the kind of Christianity that happens. So this tendency to persist from below, even when there are massive changes from above, that wipe away or unintentionally tries to wipe away the culture, you still have this resonating voice. So there's still this Celtic truth. There's this Celtic expressiveness that persists in Ireland and Scotland and Wales, even though English was imposed and different kinds of governments were imposed. So we can think about a kind of Christianity that began in the early Middle Ages, but is still reflective of the people and the language and the culture and the style that is informing each other. What is Celtic Christianity? The Celtic regions can thus be seen in more pure, unconquered sense in Ireland and Scotland, but resonate throughout Gaul, which is now called mostly France. Rome was invading France relatively early on and wiping out the indigenous cultures or co-opting them very early, but there's still the kind of resonating Gaulish Celtic impact that persists. We can also see this in Spain and other regions of Europe where there is a Celtic culture that exists underlying that's very distinct from the Southern Europe cultures of Greece and Rome. And even if the languages and a lot of the other things have this wrapping, there's still a different kind of culture among them. We can see the Celtic impact going even as far as Galatia. So Paul's letter to the Galatians, if there's a famous statue called the Dying Gaul, and so the Celtic influences actually reached that far. So this is a kind of culture that has a resonating impact and almost a competition, for instance, from the direct Mediterranean coast communities. Very few cultures, of course, exist in isolation, so we can also look at the resonating influences. Notice I'm distinguishing that versus colonizing influences. Colonizing influences are imposed, they're enforced, they're making people change their ways based on imposition, and whether moral or actual physical, versus oh, you're doing something interesting. And all cultures are informed by each other. We are informed by what's going on in Asia. There's a lot of popular culture that comes. I'm in Southern California, this nexus of cultures coming from the South and the East and the West. And there's just a lot of that where we celebrate and become a new, distinct kind of culture that's different from both the Northern and the Eastern and the Western, but is informed by all of them. And so this happened in the Celtic lands too. So Ireland, as I said, was informed by the culture that was happening, but didn't see these as things to compete or were imposing until later, but actually resonated and were in conversation with. So we don't have this Celtic Christianity that's separate from European continental Christianity. It was all informed. It was being informed by. Sadly, it didn't have as much of a total impact going back into the continent, but it actually did because of the thriving of the kind of Celtic monastic works that then they saw themselves as missionaries. So there was a much more of a conversation that continues to have a resonating impact. Ian Bradley, one of our authors, offers this definition of Celtic Christianity: the native indigenous Christian faith practiced by those living in the British Isles in the early medieval period, and more specifically those Celtic-speaking areas, the lands that would become Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and certain parts of England, notably Cumbria, Cornwall, other western areas before they were overrun by Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Vikings. My name, Odin, actually brings this into play. The Odin family actually came from Scotland, not Sweden as the name might represent, going back to around the Viking era. So my family were likely Vikings who landed in the northeast of Scotland, the mid-east of Scotland, and then came to the North America in the 1600s. It was this part of me, though, is also exceedingly English and has some Irish roots. So I have this mixed journey in my own DNA. So what is it, Celtic? It's this kind of culture that happened before these outside cultures increasingly made it smaller and smaller. And a pure Celtic culture, we can still say, exists in pockets. When England invaded Ireland, for instance, it pushed the Irish-speaking peoples into the northwest corner. And so there are still places in Ireland that Ireland is the primary spoken language. The key issue here, in light of these definitions, in light of the discussions, in light of my attempt to help you understand what is Celtic Christianity, the key issue that I'm wrestling with, and I invite you to wrestle with me, does Christian theology and practice encourage, even demand, conformity and homogeneity, or does it encourage diversity and distinction? This is a question that has been asked since the time of the writing of the New Testament. Read the book of Acts. Read the letter to the Galatians. Were the Gentile Christians being called to conform to Jewish law, or could they exist within their own kind of cultural expression within a wider understanding of Christianity? Paul wrestled with this. Go on later, there was a debate about, well, if England is informed by both the Celtic influence and the Roman influence, which is a pick because they thought we had to be homogenous, and so they actually ended up picking the Roman rites at the Council of Whitby. But what does that mean for us as we continue to ask this question, as we're increasingly exposed to not only diversity globally, but diversity within our own neighborhoods? How can we understand Christianity in a non-homogeneous, non-conforming way without giving up what it means to be distinctly Christian? How can we be diverse and distinct while sharing a common hope and a common salvation and a common transformation in the Spirit? If it's the first, that we have to demand conformity. Well, what's the base model? What's the orienting expression? What's the true Christianity? Am I, as a Protestant, rejecting Christianity because I'm not a Roman Catholic? If the latter, encouraging diversity and distinction, what are the boundaries beyond which it is no longer Christianity? And I will say a statement here, and some of you may disagree. I think that while the Latter-day Saints and Jehovah's Witnesses have a very interesting and profound faith and commitment and discussion of Jesus, they are doing something differently than the historic Christian faith that I see myself aligned with. But there are some in the Roman Catholic and Orthodox Church who might say the same about me. And that's, well, where are the boundaries? Is it ecclesial government? Is it a shared theology? Is it our common bond in other ways? Well, that's a key issue that I want to invite you into as we wrestle with this. What it isn't, or doesn't include, and this is reflections on Ian Bradley's chapter 8. And I'm going to riff off this and a little bit more reflective of what I'm going to be doing for the rest of the lectures throughout this class. He argues, and I think this is true, that the Celtic theology doesn't include, and so you see this as a list of things it doesn't include, a priority on the crucifixion. Certainly in the Reformation and medieval era, we have this priority on the cross. That is there in Celtic theology. You can see this actual cross that I have here. This is a model of a famous tall cross in Ireland, and it's a focus on not just the crucifixion, but the whole stories and different stories. So it was actually a lesson. It was made out of Irish peat. In fact, I got it in Ireland about 20 years ago. So it's there, but the priority isn't exclusively there. It's a much more engaged kind of focus on the broader message of Christianity, including the resurrection, including transformation, in that way reflecting much more of an Eastern Orthodox approach. And we'll get into that in later in this discussion, but also going forward. It doesn't focus on patripassianism, with divine suffering, the idea that God died on the cross or God suffered. Now, here's where I'm going to be critical about Bradley. Bradley uses the work of Jürgen Moltmann of talking about divine suffering in, I think, a mistaken way. I don't think he uses it in a mistaken way. I'm just going to go out and say it. He misunderstands what Moltmann is doing and applies it to a historical term that was seen as a heresy in order to link into some of the models of what God has to be. God has to be not experience any kind of passions or emotions or all the rest. So he says, well, God the Father didn't suffer. That's what passipassianism means on the cross. And it says, Moltmann says he did suffer. Well, this is where the Father didn't die physically on the cross with the Son. The suffering of God in the cross wasn't the physical suffering, but it was there was an emotional impact when someone you love is suffering. The loss, the kind of response God has for us with sin, when we betray God. All through the Old Testament, you can see the emotions of God being expressed. All through the Psalms, you can see this take place. And while he's right in saying they don't talk about God being linked, there's a wonderful Trinitarian expression throughout Celtic theology that actually reflects an undercurrent of their philosophy and thinking that even before Christianity, there is an understanding of God's emotional self. They're not afraid of God's suffering, and as we understand that psychologically. Now, the problem here is suffering and change means different things to ancient cultures than it means to us, where suffering means being imposed on. You're being imposed on and forced, and we don't want to say God was ever forced, but God is emotional. And I'm saying that in contrast to what a lot of common systematic theology says, but I'm saying that in line with saying when Scripture talks about God's emotions, it's not just trying to use language that makes sense to us, it's actually expressive of God's response. We are created beings made in the image of God, and I believe that that actually is involved in our emotions, and the fruit of the Spirit is reflective of emotions. I can go on and on. In fact, I do. You can read my book, Hope for the Oppressor, in which I have a really long discussion on this. It doesn't focus on predestination. It's closer to Arminian than Reformed in general. So it's really an understanding that we are being invited into a process, synergistic, much more reflecting a Eastern Orthodox approach. Again, we don't want to bring later arguments or later divisions, but because they don't have the same kind of philosophical categories, they really didn't get caught up in these questions in the same way. But they did have this sense of the idea that we're called into this story and that we have this ability to be disciplined in this story. Is this a regional cultural reflection of British Isles versus continental Europe? Maybe. The idea that you actually participate and can choose to participate in the story rather than have fate guide you. They don't emphasize purgatory, this cleansing experience. They don't emphasize penal substitution, the focus on judgment rather than atonement. They focus on God, which is very Old Testament, right? This idea that we see God responding to contrast, but it's not as much a legal discussion. It doesn't include or doesn't focus on as much Pauline theology. Of course, like with the crucifixion, it's not anti that. It's just not as prioritizing this side of things. Much more Johannine, much more Gospels, much more Psalms in a lot of ways. It doesn't focus on pride. It's not really focusing on this, how can I be this? It's really understanding in a more humble, transformative need sense. It tends to reflect what we are now call Eastern Orthodox, as I said, theological themes rather than Roman Catholic and Protestant, and for very important historical reasons. And that turns us to a very quick, very abbreviated intro to John Cassian. John Cassian is not Celtic. So why am I introducing this class? Why did I wrestle so much about actually requiring reading Cassian's work? Why am I going to be referring to him all throughout? Why is he and his influence going to reflect in a lot of ways the desert spirituality? John Cassian, I'll raise a little tension before I get to the answer to that. He was likely born in Scythia, which is now Romania and Ukraine, around 365. He spent 10 years in a monastery in Bethlehem, visiting other monasteries during that time and area. So he got like the heart of the Christian narrative. He was there. Like, what does it mean to be spiritual there? He likely knew Jerome, who was famous for translating the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate, but also had so much influence and impact in other ways. But rather than finding this new life in this very actual birthplace of Christianity, where Christ was born, literally, he found that the spirituality and the monastic practices were not up to what he thought they should be. And it wasn't that he was aggressive. It's like all sorts of Christian communities, right? You have this passionate group and then become lax in discipline, lax in spirituality. So being frustrated by that, trying to find his own life and story and fulfillment, just like I have gone to different places. I went to Wheaton College to find much the same thing. I was so frustrated by the kinds of theologies that I was experiencing in the churches I was part and found this depth and richness there, not without its own weaknesses. He visited the deserts of Egypt, where men and women were renowned for both discipline and spirituality. We can talk about Anthony of Egypt being the first famous monastic who started this great movement of people who said, what does it mean to be as full in prayer and full of life, overcoming sin and the power of the Spirit? Well, they found that in the deserts of Egypt. He went to Constantinople. He was influenced by the famous preacher John Chrysostom, who was the bishop there, became a friend of Leo, the future pope. So he went from the deserts of Egypt and learned this great spirituality, but was also in these big discussions about the heights. So he learned from below, but it was also in discussions with those in above. In 415, he traveled to Marseille and now France. He founded a monastery for men and women there based on the Egyptian Cenobitic model. What is that? Well, you have the Heremitic, which is the hermits living all by yourself, and then you have the community-based monastic communities. So he founded it based on the Egyptian monastic communities of a gathered, shared discipline and shared commitment and these rules, and founded a monastery in southern France. So here's the connection. The theology and the practices of the Christian East in Egypt became transplanted in the very west in southern Gaul. And from there, missionaries went out into northern France, into Britain, into then Ireland. A theology of the East jumped over the Mediterranean and filled the far west of Christian Europe. He became a strong influence for Benedict, the rule of St. Benedict, and the formation of monasticism in far western Europe, especially Gaul, Britain, Ireland, and influencing Benedict, and in that the ways that they actually then thrive in a thriving, disciplined way in the West. This Irish Celtic understanding of monasticism drifted back. So we have Egyptian monasticism jumping from the east to Gaul, and then jumping up into Ireland, and then from Ireland coming back down and filling and influencing all the way back into Italy. So there's this conversation, but theologically, there's still these distinctives. We can even say, because they overlapped in time, that there's a good chance he was a teacher of Patrick. As you'll get into next time, in reading the writings of Patrick, you'll learn a little bit of his story. He was enslaved, then he escaped, and there's a big gap of where we don't quite know his story, and there's some strong suspicion that in becoming a priest about a decade later, he may have traveled into this very center of learning and may have known John Cassian. He doesn't mention it, but we don't have very much writing. So you have this direct influence, and all throughout the teachings and his writings and a lot of what we're going to read throughout the many things, it's reflective of the desert spirituality and the way John Cassian framed priorities and values. So reading John Cassian actually can influence how we understand Celtic Christianity. And we have to, I think, come at it from both directions. We have to read, not as much as in this class, but we will. We have to engage the Celtic culture and writings and themes, and the more we read of their stories and their religious and the myths and all the rest, the more we can actually understand how that influenced what Celtic Christianity came. They weren't becoming someone non-Celtic. They were taking these impulses of these stories and priorities and putting it into a Christian worldview. Same too, that Cassian shaped how they thought about that. It was the interpretive lens of Christianity that shaped how they engaged their culture. So when we talk about John Cassian, these two major books. There's a few. He wrote a lot, but there's about three books that we have still. Two major ones. One is the Institutes, which is more of a guide about how to live a monastic life. It also has some really great expanded sections on dealing with sin, the 8 deadly sins. The Conferences, which is, I think, one of the more popular versions, which had a deep impact in Christian Europe. With Benedict, and he next to the Bible, he said Cassian was his main resource. And we're going to read a little bit of this. The Conferences is dialogues with Egyptian abbots, so you can already see here how the language of the East was transplanted to the Celtic discussions we had. Reconstructed by Cassian. He obviously didn't have a tape recorder, so he had these, he genuinely, with his friend, visited them. But they were reconstructed conversations. People had better memories than we do now, of course, because they were used to that. But it was still him remembering, but also repurposing some of these conversations, likely not transcribed. It was a mix of authentic interactions and intentional theological shaping in light of the issues and concerns and conversations he was having. For instance, the 13th Conference of John Cassian is directly shaped to rebut some of the Augustinian perspectives on freedom of the will. So we have to read these with Cassian's intentions in mind. We can say, well, this is reflective of Desert Egypt, or this is Abbot this person or that person, but we don't want to say this is a direct testimony of this person he's quoting. This is Cassian's work, informed by, shaped by, but still him. Themes cover a wide range of monastic, spiritual, personal, social issues. So again, integrative, conversational, engaged with a lot of practical. What I love about Eastern, the monastics like this, is they were so earthy. They were so actually wanting to wrestle with real issues. They're not like us today in our academic world. We're like, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about that. They are actually just very honest in trying to say, well, what does it mean to live out the Christian life? And they weren't just like black and white in terms of it's either this or that. There's a lot of gray of like, do you keep a promise? Well, there's a lot of complexity of what's God calling you to do. And even that discussion can become controversial. What does it mean to be a person of God in light of temptations and challenges? Who are we to be and how do we get there? It's about the journey, not just the calling. It's not the end that we're focused on. It's also the skopos, the goal, the path. And in light of that, we actually see a much more complex engagement with the fullness of Christian life than just show up to church and get to heaven. There are some who argue that he's a semi-Pelagianist. Now, Pelagius is another conversation, and I think we're going to do some reading about him, who originally was a British monk who came down to southern Europe and spoke some of the priorities that were happening in Ireland in an Augustinian conversation, and in the taking the Celtic theological discussions and putting them into the categories of southern Europe, which didn't actually work really well. He was condemned as a heretic. And there's some debate about that. Well, Cassian isn't a Pelagius. He doesn't say that we can work our way to salvation. That's what the summary of Pelagius is. You have complete freedom of will and can choose to do good and work your way towards Christ. Well, that's not what Cassian says. He says, first God saves us, and then empowering us, we are empowered to live and choose to live in a new way. God doesn't completely reshape us instantly to be this new person who never sins. But in saving us, he awakens our freedom to be someone who is called by Christ. The example he uses, which I love, is like a farmer who plants a field. There's a lot of work that goes into planting a field. But if it doesn't rain, nothing grows. Grace is the rain which helps this work come alive. So the term synergy is often popular. It's absolutely 100% God's initiative, God's grace, God's efforts, God's salvation that allows us then to be a new kind of person in the work of the Holy Spirit. It's not semi-Pelagian. So often we use labels. Misreading of both Pelagius, but also a misreading of Cassian in light of different later assumptions, but also mixed motives. There's a reason to dismiss and reject people who are coming at theology from a different way. Again, the tendency towards homogeneity and conformity resists any kind of diversity. And when you have, here's our theological hero, his is the only voice, and there are people who disagree, you find ways of dismissing them. This happens continually. Like missional church people are often dismissed for being Gnostics or whatever. So the category, the label doesn't mean anything other than just sounds horrible. And that happened with Cassian, that happens with Celtic Christianity, that happens across the board. And so our journey here is to engage the resources as much as we are able to in this context, and then understand, what does it mean to be Christian? What does it mean to be Christian in our context? What does it mean for you and for me to live out the fullness of Christ as the Spirit is guiding us? And in that, being awakened to a new kind of experience of mission, of ministry, of hope, of engagement. That's the journey we're on. Let's continue with it. I'm going to end with what I know is a long discussion, with a return to our sources. Be Thou My Vision, Be My Vision is a well-known hymn, but it comes from a Irish monastic, Dylan Forgale, and around the year 600. I'm just going to read this through. Think, muse, reflect, listen on this as I read it, because this is our orienting reality in this class, in this study, in our journey this quarter. Be my vision, O Lord of my heart. There is none other but the King of the seven heavens. Be my meditation by day and by night. May it be you that I behold even in my sleep. Be my speech, be my understanding. Be with me, may I be yours. Be my battle shield, be my sword. Be my dignity, be my delight. Be my shelter, be my stronghold. Raise me up to the company of angels. Be every good to my body and soul. Be my kingdom in heaven and on earth. Be solely the chief love of my heart. Let there be none other, O High King of heaven. until I am able to pass into your hands, my treasure, my beloved, through the greatness of your love, be alone my noble, wondrous estate. I seek not people, nor lifeless wealth. Be the constant guardian of every possession and of every life, for our corrupt desires are dead at the mere sight of you. Your love in my soul and in my heart. Grant this to me, O King of the seven heavens. O King of the seven heavens, grant me this. Your love to be in my heart and in my soul, with the King of all, with him after victory won by piety. May I be in the kingdom of heaven, O brightness of the sun. Beloved Father, hear my lamentations. Timely is the cry of woe of this miserable wretch. O heart of my heart, whatever befall me, O ruler of all, be my vision.